Okay, this is Mae Brussell. It's program number 600, June the 6th, 1983. World Watchers officially begins. Have that half hour for conversation before. And this is KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California. This time last year, we were talking about the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. I was doing a two-part series on the Knights of Malta, a group that was formed by the Vatican 1,000 years ago, the military branch of the Vatican to defend the Roman Church. And I was giving names of members of the cabinet, of Ronald Reagan's cabinet, of the CIA, of the Defense Department, who are members of the Knights of Malta, who make the most important decisions for the government at the present time. The separation of church and state is getting almost impossible to define. There is very little separation in the Reagan administration because the top officials, William Clark, William Casey, the Buckleys, and Vernon Walters, all his advisors, a good hunk of them, J. Peter Grace, are knighted by the Vatican and have dual citizenship, postage stamp, flag, etc., to a place located next to the Vatican. And the question we will never know, where is their loyalty to their church or their country, or is their country to be protected by the military branch of the church to keep it one country under God? Now, in regards to the program last year, I mentioned a law firm, Sachs, S-A-X-E, Bacon, B-A-C-O-N, and Bolin. And I mentioned that Roy Cohn is a member of the law firm of Tom Bolin, who is a Knight of Malta. And last week, in 1983, just last week's program, or 2 weeks ago, I brought out the role of Roy Cohn with Western Goals with the John Birch Society and the secret files in the Los Angeles Police Department that go out to police departments in 50 states. This is a red-hot item that I will be doing a lot more on, but the problem here isn't necessarily Catholic or Jewish. Roy Cohn works with the Knights of Malta at both ends. He works in the law office representing this particular law office, and he also works with the Birch Society, who are violently anti-Semitic, and Mr. John Reese and Louise Reese and people like Mr. Oliver of the Birch Society, who recommend that all Jews in this country should be gassed, in other countries also. I also mentioned a year ago tonight that Roy Cohn was the partner of David Schein. Many of you remember that during the years of the Senator Joe McCarthy hearings and chasing commies all over the world and in the United States. David Schein owns the Ambassador Hotel. He always has for years and years. And that was where Robert Kennedy was murdered just 15 years ago tonight. First, Ethel and Robert had dinner with Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski. And many of you know that. Some of you don't know that. Then went on to the Ambassador Hotel, where a security guard, Thane, Cesar, shot Robert Kennedy in the back of the head. He works in Riverside, and he was sent from Lockheed, which, again, is part of the Howard Hughes, Robert Mayu organization. The assassination team sent a guard from Lockheed to kill Robert Kennedy. Sirhan will be paroled. He's up for parole, and I understand it's about to come. It's been 15 years. He mentioned that he'd like to go back there. He can't remember what happened. He did shoot 4 people in the Ambassador Hotel. His bullets went into 4 different people, but they weren't the bullets that went in the back of the senator or the back of the head that were described by Thomas Noguchi in the autopsy. Cardinal Spellman was the military and spiritual center for the Knights of Malta in the United States, and I talked about him last week and his role in Vietnam. And I said Mr. Spellman was Cardinal Pacelli. He then became Pope Pius XII and had an instrumental role in working with Adolf Hitler and Mussolini. That was last year. This last week, a new book came out, La Popessa, Popessa, the controversial biography of the most powerful woman in Vatican history. This is supposed to be a very good book by Paul Murphy, published by Warner Books. She is Pasalina, P-A-S-C-A-L-I-N-A. I'm just reading a section from a description of this book. The Bavarian-born nun who emerged from rural obscurity to become the confidant and the advisor to Pope Pius XII through his rise and reign. She was his partner from Munich uprising in 1920s to the end of Pius's life. She was behind the scenes. She is the person who shared his thoughts Eugenio Pacelli, Pacelli, who later becomes Pius XII. While he was dealing with Hitler, Mussolini, Churchill, and Roosevelt, she was part of all those meetings, and she is, I believe, aged now, an old woman, and has this book, a controversial biography of the most powerful woman in Vatican history. One book review says that it describes everything but they're going to bed together, but even implies that. So La Popessa is about Pacelli, and last year I was talking about Pacelli and Cardinal Spellman and the Knights of Malta. Also, Mr. Grace, very important person that was with George DeMohrenschildt, Oswald's contact, the Grace Company, and the Knights of Malta. I went into Mr. Nicholas Brady and Joseph Grace, and William Russell Grace described in the book The Nazis Go Underground with his connections in South America to forming the Nazi movement over again, Mr. William Russell Grace. The Los Angeles Police Department enters in this year to what I was talking about last year because Mr. J. Peter Grace worked with Robert Milliken on the board of his company, J. Peter Grace, and Citibank, and they funded Senator Strom Thurmond, remember, and on the sheet that goes with tape number 548, a year ago tonight, I said they were part of the Larry McDonald Georgia Foundation. Now, sometimes I talk very fast and I bring in so much we could, spend 3 hours if I did it slower and let these names sink in, but I do have the printed sheets that accompany this broadcast of bibliography, and if it goes too fast, send a self-addressed stamped envelope and tell me which broadcast it is that you want. Tonight is number 600, and I'll give you the names, or a year ago tonight, that broadcast is available. That's 548. And I talked about Larry McDonald. So when it turned out that the Los Angeles Police Department files were connected to a $100,000 computer in the home of John Reese and his wife that goes to Larry McDonald, and that's Murder Incorporated from Atlanta, Georgia, and also Larry McDonald formed that Western Goals Foundation with Roy Cohn, who I began talking about just a few moments ago with the partner for the Knights of Malta. So in the John Birch Society, the H.L. Hunt was a Baptist. He also was a Mormon. He took on two religions so he could have a lot of wives. But Roy Cohn's name comes through here. The Senate hearings with Senator Joe McCarthy, the links of McCarthy to the Catholic group at Georgetown, the Knights of Malta, that were feeding him names through J. Edgar Hoover and Interpol so that he can conduct Red Scares in this country and frighten people and have them lose their jobs and have that Red Scare that was so terrible through those years in the United States. Some people still suffer from what happened at the time. So a year ago, I was talking about Roy Cohn and Joe McCarthy and Larry McDonald and the various partners of Shine and Cohn. And as I say, this is the anniversary of Robert Kennedy's assassination, and it was in the Ambassador Hotel owned by David Shine. And a lot of people said it couldn't possibly be a conspiracy because nobody knew what door Robert Kennedy was going to walk out of, which pantry. Well, if you own the floor plans, you own a hotel, you could have a Sirhan at every door, somebody equivalent to him, if you wanted to have a gunman and have a setup in the Ambassador Hotel. Would be the easiest thing to do. Now, changing subjects, but not far off the subject, there was a large story in the San Francisco Examiner yesterday. Japan's World War II plan to set up a fifth column of immigrants. And this is plans a year before Pearl Harbor to send in people and use Japanese Americans or people that were anti-Semitic, similar to Hitler's ideas, blacks who didn't like this country. And Roosevelt and Secretary of War Henry Stimson understood this sabotage that was going on. Later, the excuse for rounding up the Japanese was that for a year they had been infiltrating this country and working as journalists in the United States. Now, this article that just came out is about newly released papers from the National Archives on the sabotage that was planned 1 year before Pearl Harbor, which would be 1940. And what I've said many, many weeks, and it can bear repeating over and over again, people like Peter Drucker, who formed the multinational corporations that make it possible for Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford and others to just float all over the world with their meetings with these huge corporations that are bigger than nations. Peter Drucker, Henry Kissinger, and Fritz Kramer could be fifth column that came here in 1939 put into military intelligence, and then worked with the top Nazis as soon as the war was over, and during the war also. So that the sabotage that was going on, planting people in this country a year before, very easily coming from the East-Western division, say, it's our west, the ocean, but it's the eastern, Far East. The same thing was coming from Germany over here. Now, remember that Douglas MacArthur, his chief of intelligence, was Colonel Willoughby. It's Kurt Wiedenbach, a German who fought with Franco, a Nazi, set up American intelligence in the Pacific Ocean. So he could be sending journalists and so forth to undermine the United States, just as Mr. Peter Drucker took credit for bringing Fritz Kramer to this country, and Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger meet and then go on with the top Nazis of the world up to this day. So that the intent to set up the fifth column a year earlier in 1940 with Japanese and anti-Semites and news media is consistent with what I knew was going on the East Coast and with John McCloy working in Europe from 1930 and 1940. And then these people suddenly coming to this country and putting on American uniforms. I got a letter from Peter McAlpine. Some of you know him, some of you don't. He has a conspiracy digest. He doesn't print it anymore, but I want to tell you he has reprints of his old articles, and they're very valuable. And I want to give you the address. Write to Alpine Enterprises, P.O. Box 766, Dearborn, Michigan 48121. Now, he has a package for $30 for all of his past issues. Of course, the best one, I think, was in winter 77, 78. It was an interview with Mae Brussell on the world in general, the assassination teams, and particularly Henry Kissinger, the Nazification of America with Henry Kissinger. But he has a newsletter that started in 1976 and went till 1979. And all of those together are only $30. So if you send that address or write to him and get his new digest, he has lists of books that are very hard to get. His books are terribly expensive, and I would try research with Tom Davis at Capitola to collect these books first because they're very, very expensive, his books. But there's some that we can't get, and sometimes you have to pay him for those. Now, this is graduation week. There was a picture of John. He graduated. John Kennedy is all grown up now. Went out of Brown University with a history degree today. What do you think? So I just made a few notes of what John's got to learn. Now he's got to unlearn everything he learned at Brown and everything he learned at home. And for graduation present, I just thought, I'll give John my entire library, 3,000 books, everything on the assassinations, if he'll investigate his mother's role with Aristotle Onassis and John J. McCloy. You know, this kid graduating in history is the stuff that Shakespeare wrote about and the Greek dramas and the entanglement of being right in the midst of all this activity and thinking, I will study history. Where do you start if you're John Kennedy Jr.? One article I have from Jack Anderson, May 21st, 1975. The law office for Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, when she got her 20 to 26 million settlement from Aristotle Onassis's estate, goes through the office of John J. McCloy in New York City. Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy. McCloy was on the Warren Commission that covered up who murdered her husband, but he handles her 26 million from Onassis. And Onassis was the place where she was the summer before she went to Dallas when Kennedy said, get your butt home as fast as you can, and you're going in the motorcade with me, Tootsie. And when she got back to the White House, Onassis was the first person in the White House, and then she went on the yacht, got her 26 million, wrote a contract, and McCloy handled it, and also that was a nice settlement, but she had to go through that. That's the way it went. Another article I have from American Opinion, the John Birch Society, on John J. McCloy, and it tells how the office of Chase Manhattan, and McCloy was on the board of Chase Manhattan, was the attorney for the Soviet Union after the Bolsheviks came in, handling the Nobel family's giant Caucasian oil fields, the Baku oil fields. The Chase Manhattan, the Rockefellers were working through the Chase Bank, and this is John McCloy with the Baku oil fields and the Nobel. Now, the very first person that contacted Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, in the Fort Worth area, was George DeMohrenschildt. He knew Jackie Auchincloss was at their home in Long Island when she was little. He was Lee Harvey Oswald's contact for the Defense Department. His father managed the Baku oil fields, the Nobel oil fields, before the Bolsheviks came over. He ran them for the Tsarists, and then the DeMohrenschildt family fled. and went to Poland and to Belgium and then to the United States Defense Department. And when Marina Oswald's brought from Minsk, I always thought she was related either to George Bowie or George DeMohrenschildt from Minsk. John J. McCloy and George DeMohrenschildt and Jackie Onassis had a cute little circle of relationship. There's a matter of fact, when George DeMohrenschildt was traveling in Mexico, he carried an ID from Chase Manhattan and Nelson Rockefeller for his money or the money he needed. This is before he attached himself as an agent to Lee Harvey Oswald. So maybe John should study Onassis, and maybe he should study that little subject. And then also when Jimmy Carter was having trouble in the Middle East, he calls in, according to the New York Times, this is September 30th, 1979, his special team, 15 high officials for advice. Henry Kissinger and William Rogers, both on the board of 20th Century Fox, now covering the drug market, the worldwide drug market, and the Defense Department, Clark Clifford. John McCloy, again, the advisor to Jimmy Carter. Brent Scowcroft, the protege of Fritz Kramer, the National Security Advisor to President Ford. And Nicholas Katzenbach, who was Undersecretary of State for Lyndon Johnson and who covered up the John Kennedy murder. And he was the first person to give orders to start bugging and following the people who were doing research to find out who killed John Kennedy. So Mama's lawyer is really tangled with some pretty heavy company, heavy duty. So now John has to unlearn what he learned if he's going to be a history major, or else he's going to fall into the same trap his father did, because they're not going to let them get too far, the Kennedy clan. And someday they got to get their smarts about them. The Pope urged this week that U.S. senators set human rights examples for the world. This was the Associated Press from Vatican City, June the 5th. 6 senators went to see the Pope. I'm only going to mention 2 of them in terms of research. One is Richard Lugar, Republican from Indiana, Orrin Hatch from Utah, you know that fella, and Arlen Specter from Pennsylvania, the Republican. Well, Lugar had a notorious scandal that surfaced and was hushed up at the time of Watergate. It was in the newspapers, 1976, bizarre scheme entwines a senator. He was supposed to have had a Swiss bank account, according to the Night News Service, and some people said it was fake, but that the signature was forged, but it was never put to a court or put to a test. He had a bank account in Switzerland of $1,350,000 opened April 10th, 1972, 3 days after a campaign law that Richard Nixon's money and contributions would have to be declared, and this was done 3 days after, and he hadn't declared it. The signature of the money for the Republican Party via Mr. Lugar went from Horia Sima, Horia Sima, a fugitive Nazi war criminal living in Spain since the end of World War II. There are many top Nazis that funded Richard Nixon's career straight through, but Senator Lugar had the bank account. The details opened April 10th, 1972, getting money from Spain from Horia Sima, Nazi war criminal, to put in the Republican coffers. And the Pope is saying, oh, Mr. Lugar, let's have some human rights. And the other person, Arlen Specter, was the man from the Warren Commission who invented the one bullet theory against the law of physics that covered up the mafia and the Nazi connections to the murder of John Kennedy. He defied all the laws of science and physics. Arlen Specter is a rat over there in the Vatican with Lugar, and the Pope is asking for human rights. And of course, you know Orrin Hatch's position towards equal rights and abortions and so forth. I mean, very far right. But the other 2 men were involved in the intrigue of Nazis and the covering up Nazis and money from Nazis. And the Pope, true to his tradition, is telling them and entertaining them to speak of human rights. Now, I mentioned the Pope with his scandal with Hermann Apps. This was about in November, half a year ago. November, tape 573. If you want to look up that broadcast, or if you don't have it, you can get it. And I mentioned that at the height of the scandal, Banco Ambrosiano and Roberta Calvi, the president of the bank, was hung in London, and the scandal of the bank was opening up. They had $1.2 billion in dummy fronts in Panama, doorknobs. They still won't tell where it is. Paul Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank, is still hiding in the Vatican. So in order to solve the problem, the Pope brought in Hermann Apps to control the problem. And I never did have time to go into the details of Hermann Apps with you, because as long as the Pope is talking about human rights, let's get on with the Auschwitz Pope and human rights. It was the New York Times article, November 27th, 1982, that Mr. Apps, of high international standing of West Germany, is added to the panel of 3 to supervise the Vatican funds. Well, one article about Apps was put out by the Holocaust Center in Los Angeles, and this particular article has the case against Hermann Apps. Hermann Apps was the most important financial figure in the Third Reich. Without him, the banker industrialist, the Nazi economy couldn't have developed into the phenomenal thing it is. And they have the story of the Vatican Bank. 2, his influence was described as tremendous by Baron Kurt von Schroeder, Schroeder, chairman of the Gestapo's bank in Cologne, Cologene. In 1941, IG Farben was the most powerful chemical industrial conglomerate in Nazi Germany, and Hermann Apps helped build the rubber plant in the infamous Auschwitz concentration camp, and that branch of Farben was called Solvay, where the Pope was working before he was a Pope or a priest, and then went on to Montini from Milan, the Milan Mafia in Rome, the Secretary of the Vatican at the time. They say that he was the bank's representative on every board. He was the chairman of many boards and industries and businesses in Germany throughout the entire war. The Deutsche Bank contributed to the Adolf Hitler Fund every year. The Friends of the Himmler Circle, at the discretion of Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer, the SS. They handled the account of Goering, Ribbentrop, Rosenberg, the Nazi Party head office. This is Mr. Apps. Hermann Apps was on the advisory board of the Reichsbank, and at the Nuremberg trial testimony, he was accused of looting gold from the camps, including Auschwitz. He was sentenced to 6 years, but he got off thanks to John J. McCloy. He didn't have to serve all of that sentence. Now, I have references for you from different books that was sent from a world watcher in New York. Incidentally, there's a book, Fascism Today, and it tells the role of Hermann Apps building up the IG Farben through the Marshall Plan, the restructuring of Germany, similar to Nazi Germany and the banks today, as soon as the war was over. The Brown Book, which is a study of Nazi war criminals, page 39 and 49, has the story of Mr. Hermann Apps. As manager of the Deutsche Bank and director of IG Farben, he ran slave labor, where children were killed, people were tortured, they were undernourished. They asked him, to stop this, using these small children for slave labor. They worked until they died, and he was the man who helped select the location of Auschwitz for IG Farben for their rubber plant, and he went there many times and supervised it as the head of the German bank. That's Hermann Apps. So the Brown, Tieten's New Germany and the Old Nazis also has a description of Hermann Apps and his role in building up Germany after the war and continuing in the powerful position that he has today, where he's right back again with the Vatican Bank. So when the Pope talks about human rights, the way he should show his sincerity in human rights is not to put Hermann Apps, the symbol of all this pain and torture, running the Vatican Bank that's in trouble already because it's dealing with hidden funds, because how do we know where it's going now if it isn't going back to the same old Nazis? Now, last week I mentioned the article that's coming out in the American Weekly next week. Look for it in your Sunday paper so that you won't have to write and ask me for it. It's a magazine section. Luckily, our Monterey Herald has it, and for those of you in the East around the country that don't get it, it's in over 300 newspapers on Sunday. There will be the story of Klaus Barbie. But Barbie, I mentioned several items about the article last week, how he plotted to become the next Fuhrer and worked for the CIA from 1971 to 82. But he was more than that. This article will go into more details, and it's very important because the war in Lebanon and in Beirut right now is over the valley, the Baku Valley, and the concentration of narcotics, the Jamal family and the dealings of the Falange, and getting the cocaine from down in Bolivia and Peru and processing it over there in Lebanon, and the role of the CIA in these countries of being the middleman, shipping and allowing these Nazis to trade together and then using the profits for more political right-wing death squads around the world. Now, one listener, subscriber to World Watcher, sent me the press release of this new article that's coming out that I mentioned last week, that Klaus Barbie masterminded the cocaine traffic. He was a colonel in the Bolivian secret police. he recruited a 6,000-man Nazi military group that wear the uniforms and the Heil Hitler, so forth, down in Bolivia. I'm sure they didn't disappear just because he's in France today. Mr. Gomez was one of his partners. Gomez has been arrested and might be sent to the United States. That's Luis, Luis, Arce Gomez, Arcegomez. Now, once Bolivia became socialist, the American government offered something like $74 million last week to stop the flow of cocaine because they don't want the profits to get in the hands of the socialists. It can be in the hands of the CIA or the Nazis. We tried to buy off, Richard Nixon tried to buy off Turkey. And the people depended on the narcotics traffic there. And when the Pope was shot, I said one of the motives could be Ajaz living in the middle of that area where all of their money was cut off by the American government. And the profit went in the hands of a few people to stop the traffic there so that the Shah of Iran could be the chief drug user and distributor coming out of the war in Southeast Asia and out of the Middle East. In order to give the Shah the profits that go into Chase Manhattan Bank and William Rogers and Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford, in order to keep that going, they wanted the Turkish opium cut off so that they could control their own territory. With this Klaus Barbie, it taught them as if they needed teaching in the interrogation methods down in Bolivia. And you'll see the article of how in 1971, as I said before, that's when he really becomes a big shot. Now, when Richard Nixon becomes president, that is when all the drug traffic from Southeast Asia, the war in Vietnam, South America, and the Middle East begins to pour in this country. So that while he was a leading organizer of the cocaine traffic and the CIA knew it, they began to put him on the payroll, and he worked directly with the Central Intelligence Agency while he was doing the drug running. He was given a shipping line that provided travel documents for him into the United States, where he visited on many occasions. They say 4, but there's no way of knowing if there's more. And he was in Europe, and he had identification and could go all over the world. But he organized death squads, and the fiancé of death, that terrible, dreaded squad down there, so that what you get in Klaus Barbie is a microcosm of what is going on in many, many countries in Southeast Asia, Middle East, and all over the world. And they're shipping the narcotics now down to Africa also. That's just what they need down there, is to begin the narcotic traffic there. There's not enough problems. And pouring it into the United States, into Detroit and New York and California and so forth. Well, Barbie worked for the government. They helped him escape. They lied to the French where he was. Why was he so valuable? When the war was over, did we need these narcotics? Do we need the fiancés of death? Do you need 6,000 Nazis in Bolivia saying Heil Hitler and wearing the uniforms? What did the American government need that Barbie was so precious? If you locked him up and put him in jail forever, would the world be any worse off? Why did we go to such lengths to get him out, get him set in Bolivia, and then as soon as Kennedy is killed and Johnson's out, Nixon's home free, and boy, the profits, these people, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, and I don't have to tell you what kind of profits were in and are in the drug market. Now, a listener from New York sent me a story about the drug traffic in the Middle East and Lebanon, and she called me to say, Mae, this is what you were saying at the time of the invasion a year ago, and I was talking about the narcotic traffic. It's an article by Joseph Volz, incidentally enough, VOLZ. Many of you remember his name. He was for public broadcasting at the time the House Select Committee was on, and he covered up the clues and the pieces then. But he's written a good article on Nugan Hand, and now he has one, Link of the Government to Cocaine, the Beirut Connection to Cocaine. And this is an extensive article on the Jamal family and Israel and the Middle East and South America, closely dealing with South America. And what they want to do is to get the PLL cleaned out so that they have control, total control of all the narcotics in the area and let them flow. And this article says that even though we work with Jamal, we don't want to press him about this. We know that he floods narcotics into the United States. We know that they're coming into New York and Detroit, but the government doesn't want to say anything. Well, why not? Why are they so precious? We'll take a 1-minute break here and be back in 1 minute. And, of course, you know, at the time we take a break here, for those of you who don't have this part of the tape, elsewhere we ask for money to send to this station, or if another station plays this broadcast there, but particularly on KAZUFM. And Now, this is side 2 of broadcast number 600. This is June the 6th, 1983. There's so much news this week. I put all the main articles out, bought another box of 100 folders, and filled them in one afternoon. But I do want to get into the drug connections because the very important thing that is breaking in the news now and in so many articles are the links of the United States government, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the mafia, the big cocaine, heroin drug leaders, and the religious leaders of, say, Israel and the Vatican and the United States, the religious leaders in this narcotics traffic, this three-way bind that they've gotten themselves into. And I want to share some articles on Lebanon. Also, there are two major articles that came out just in the past few weeks on the Nugan Bank in Australia. If I have time, I'll go into this evening again. One is from the Miami Herald, the failed bank linked to the CIA, May the 8th, 1983. And it goes into how the FBI, the CIA, the United States State Department, and the Justice Department are right linked into this terrible scandal, including those top, it says, who's who of the armed services and intelligence. U.S. General Leroy Manor, retired Chief of Staff of the U.S. Forces in Asia and Pacific, helped run the Nugan Philippine office, while Rear Admiral Earl Buddy Yates was the bank's first president. Now, remember, Nugan broke, and I had it on the air a couple of years ago. I've talked about Edwin Wilson, and Frank Turple and Nugan years before the establishment media would recognize the problem, and then Wall Street Journal came in just a year ago with stories. But this one story from Miami tells you about these military. General Edwin Black, former Assistant Army Chief of Staff of the Pacific, ran Nugan Hawaii office. And these names aren't new to you, but for new listeners, it's very important to know there's a General Earl Koch, C-O-C-K-E Jr., who allowed the Nugan Bank to use his Washington offices as a consultant. Now, when this gets into the Miami Herald, which is somewhat of a military area too, military bases, and it tells about narcotics, cocaine, drug trafficking, murder, the failed bank, the collapse, the missing money, the illegal arms, and how William Colby of the CIA was involved. $50 million is missing from a Bahamas bank. I wonder, from Singapore alone, $50 million is missing from Singapore alone. And then in the Philippines, there's another $3 million missing. And it goes into the Bahama banks and the secrecy. And, of course, you know, the big problem with the Vatican has to do with the Bahama banks and where that money goes. So the recycling, this was $50 million to $1 billion. This is the military, the generals, the admirals, the CIA, heroin, cocaine, murder, drugs, arms, and so forth. And then they link to Aldo Muro's murder and the politics of Italy and the murder of Allende down in Chile. There's another story, land of killers, pushers, pimps, and corruption in high places. This is London Times. And they're trying to say that Australia is a mess of corruption, that there are 10 committees investigating. Organized crime is unchecked and out of control. It tells about the $2,219 million alone turnover in organized crime in Australia. Now, the CIA began to bring that in, and they blame the Australians for this when the CIA military in Southeast Asia began that problem. They talk about an heiress, Juanita Nielsen, who was murdered. There are bodies here they describe, and I'll do a little more on that later. And another story from the London Observer, United Kingdom's agents stage third world plots, and it's about the Nugan Bank, the secrecy, the takeover of governments, and the use of coups and murders and drugs and so forth. So that is surfacing at this time. Now, getting back to Lebanon, because this ties in to the Vatican connections, to the South American connections, the Australian connections, and Washington, and Ronald Reagan, and Paul Laxalt, and Richard Nixon with his narcotic connections. This story this week, report Begin planned Beirut invasion. Many of you heard that story. You remember a year ago that I said that this whole setup was done killing the ambassador in London, the Israeli ambassador, Mr. Shlomo Argov, as the excuse to make an invasion that they planned before. And this article is about Alexander Haig saying to Israel, go ahead and clean out the PLO. Someone has to do it. You do it. Mr. Clark didn't want it done, according to this story. At least he bows out of it. Caspar Weinberger didn't want it, according to this story. But what happens is Haig says, go ahead and do it. Well, does Alexander Haig run the foreign policy with Israel? Of course he does. He just says, go on and do it. Cling him out. That's what the article says. It says Jamal can't do it because there's an election coming up, so you do it. You get rid of him. Attack the Muslim population in the western sector. And the Christians needed the Israeli soldiers, and so Haig told, Begin, go on in and do it. Jamal won the election, but he was killed September 14th, the same day that Grace Kelly was killed. And the Israeli militias go in and look the other way, don't report the murders. And one of the top people responsible for this entire bloodbath is going to be promoted again in the military. They want him promoted. There's a controversy in Israel this week. Well, a year ago, I was talking about the dope partnership of Sharon and Jamal, the setup of the fascist Lebanese regime. And this article goes on, the one in the New York Post, Daily News rather, tells about the fascism of the Phalange and how the father set up the system of government similar to the Nazi and fascist governments in the 30s. And Israel is helping these people. Now, you have to say, well, who is running the show in any of these countries? The Jamals are part of the set up the Phalange, violently anti-Semitic, fascist, notorious dope dealers. The United States doesn't want to deal with them. They want to share the profits. Israel is a part of it. Israel walks in and does the clinging out for Jamal, and Haig is telling Begin what to do. I still say over and over again that Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer are law to themselves above anybody else. If Clark and Weinberger don't want it, Haig just says, go ahead and do it. And according to this story, this is why Alexander Haig was fired, because he went over the heads of the other people. But they had planned it for a long time. I knew they had planned it, and I knew that Israeli ambassador was the Reichstag. As a matter of fact, I used that on the broadcast a year ago in August and said that this was Sharon's Reichstag, that he set up the murder of this poor Israeli ambassador to London, Mr. Argo, as excuse to go in. And I spoke about the dope dealing a year ago. It was in August, about the narcotics of the family. And this article from New York Daily News goes at great length into the narcotics traffic, Lebanon export of hashish worldwide, major U.S. cities, particularly New York and Detroit. This is what we really need, right? And they want to get the Syrians out. They don't want them there because the Phalange wants to take over the hashish business in the Bekaa Valley. This is their franchise. And the PLO want to sell heroin. They can buy a few guns, too. I just read this morning that Gaddafi has the atomic bomb. And last week, another atomic bomb was found in Italy and was confiscated. I wonder how many are around. This article from the Daily News goes into the origin of that family, the Jamals, and how they're stuck because the Middle East was interrupted when Afghanistan was invaded by the Soviet Union. And one of the things that made Jimmy Carter so mad, and he didn't want to go to the Olympic Games, was that it interrupted the Georgia connection to the narcotics passing through Afghanistan. And according to the Daily News, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, said that they still have alternate ways of getting drugs out while this Lebanese war is going on, and they go through Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's business as usual. So this huge hashish trade is known to the United States officials. Congressman Lester Wolf says the United States will do nothing about it. Jamal is our friend, fascist, and blindly just kills, the PLO or anybody in his way. And the drugs go on into our country where the prison population is immense. The robberies, the murders for drugs is tremendous. We're paying the pains for all of the narcotics that opened up, flooded in from the time Richard Nixon was president. And, of course, Ronald Reagan and his connections to the dope syndicate are so tremendous, and the drugs are pouring in from everywhere. Now, I have a story here that Jonathan Marshall got, and David Emery sent to me, from the Italian newspaper, the Corriere della Sera, at the time of the arrest, the big drug arrest in Milan that connected the Banco Ambrosiano and to the Vatican and to worldwide drug traffic all over the world. That took place this fall. And in December, there was an article in Italy which has been translated. It said the police seized a shipment of arms of Colt rifles. We talked about Bell helicopters near Milan. Estimated, this huge group estimated to be one of the largest drug gun running centers in the entire world. On Monday morning, the police arrested a Turk, Mr. Sewka, Suka, 37, for drug trafficking, and he was arrested in Athens also, was the Syrian Mohar al-Din, D-I-N. On August the 5th, 1973, that goes back to 2 years after Claude Barbie started working as a regular CIA informant and had his hands on reorganizing all the drug traffic of Bolivia and Peru. And this is a year before, right before Richard Nixon is out, and Watergate is just at a peak of scandal here. But on August the 5th, 1973, just to set the time sequence, an agent of the Drug Enforcement Agency, and remember the Drug Enforcement Agency at the time of Watergate was E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy with Operation Intercept. You can imagine that Drug Enforcement Agency, you know what that was. On August the 5th, 1973, an agent of the Drug Enforcement Agency and a special Turkish agent made contact with Arsan. Arsan is the office in Milan in the building of Banco Ambrosiano, the bank building where Roberta Calvi was in the headquarters of the Milan Mafia. The American was Thomas Angioletti, Angioletti, Italian spelling name but American. The documents from the Italian Interior Ministry say, in quotes, "From the moment Arsan collaborated with our offices in Rome, from that moment in 1973, Arsan, the largest gun-running narcotics center in Italy, out of Milan, they started working with the drug enforcement agencies of the United States in Rome and Milan. From that moment, Arsan collaborated with our offices, from which they obtained permits with the help of the agent to get morphine base and ship it, and Arsan played a double game, going from a liquor and cigarette smuggler to big-time heroin dealer. Remember, Aristotle Onassis began with cigarettes and liquor, and Joe Kennedy with liquor. Then it went into the bigger operation. But Arsan, that office, was working with the United States Drug Enforcement Agency from 1973 on. So the story of the entanglement of heroin in the United States and Nazis and the use of it for the profits of continuing the fascist regimes all over the world has been done by our government, by the Central Intelligence Agency, and continues today. And it seems that there's no way to stop it. When a simple matter, like say the government changes hands in Bolivia, we offer them money to stop shipping. As I said, the Houston Post had that story this last week, May the 15th, 1983, several weeks ago, that the United States government made an offer. Stop growing cocaine there. We'll give you $75 million if you'll plant cocoa instead, or crops, instead of the cocaine that's coming in the United States. Well, now Mr. Gomez has been arrested, and Claude Barbie has been arrested, and the government says, no, we won't do that. You can take $20 million and turn it to $60 million like John DeLorean. Why can't we? Why would they take $75 million when they could make 100, 200, I don't know how many times over millions of dollars? So Bolivia said no, they're not going to substitute. The Reagan administration wants to substitute. Well, what will the administration do for their narcotics? One of the most treacherous things to watch that's way underplayed and not discussed enough by various researchers in the bulletin is the Japanese and the Chinese mafia from Hong Kong coming into this country. I heard stories that Reverend Moon had infiltrated those mass weddings at Madison Square Garden. Part of that was to bring in this huge narcotics traffic into the United States. These marriages where they don't have sex until he tells them, or if at all, and they marry somebody who they never knew, who comes over here, and then they get automatic citizenship. One half of the partnership is American. And I understand that this is a big conduit for not only the far right wing, but for the drug connections and families coming into the United States. It's really dangerous, and it's worth watching, but it's hard to remember those names, you know that. Anyway, the arrests in Milan were important because for the Pope Montini, who worked with John Paul II before he was a pope, who was excommunicated to Milan, then went on to Rome and referred to in the book, The Final Conclave, as the Milan Mafia. So at this time, they are shipping over to the Middle East. The Middle East is getting cocaine from Bolivia and South America. And what you have here is a group of people whose raw nerves, are being exposed now in various newspaper articles. And the one common denominator is the Central Intelligence Agency and the United States Drug Enforcement Agency that work with the Klaus Barbies and the Jamils and Arson and the Banco Ambrosiano and Paul Marcinkus, who's hiding in the Vatican, the common denominator. One of the fellows that I mentioned was going to be promoted, Brigadier General Amos Yaron. Begin wants him, he insists that he get a promotion. He was the general that was criticized for the massacre, who stood aside, who didn't report the deaths, and Begin wants the government overruled and let him be promoted now to be head of the military and military intelligence in Israel. That's just what they need. He knew about the killings and went behind, allowed the troops tell the Lebanese, come on in, massacre them, and of course Haig told them to do it, and they all had agreed in advance. Now, just changing the subject 1 minute from the drug and narcotic traffic, because I think it's interesting and important. There's so many important people that die of various accidents and diseases. The man who isolated cancer virus died this week at age 84. In Belgium, Albert Claude, 84 years old, received the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1974 for his cancer research, in which he isolated the first cancer virus in 1973. That was the Jack Ruby virus or the Martha Mitchell virus, okay? His research helped create the science of cell biology. He was known in the United States for his cell structures, and in 1944, this is 10 years later, he succeeded in using an electronic microscope to make the first pictures of cancer virus, and they were isolated. And he's had those pictures since 1944. He worked on the cancer virus. Mr. Claude won several awards, including the U.S. National Science Foundation Prize in 1966, a prize from Columbia University in 1970. Of course, the Dr. Columbia was one of those that assisted in lying on the autopsy of John Kennedy. Some of you remember that. He also got the Paul Ehrlich Prize of Frankfurt University in 1971. He worked in Germany and Belgium. He never went to high school, but he did his own worked for the Defense Department in Europe. World War I, the defense minister gave him a citation. Then he worked for British intelligence, and he worked for the Kaisers in Germany, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Germany, for cancer research in Berlin, and then for 18 years the Rockefeller Institute in New York, for which he became a member. Remember, about a year ago I talked about the fellow at the Rockefeller Institute, the graduate from Harvard, who was in Puerto Rico doing experiments on cancer. Now, cancer is a political disease, just as AIDS is, or sickle cell anemia, or the Tay-Sachs. You have AIDS and the Legionnaires and the swine flu, I believe. These are all part and parcel of experimentations going on at the present time. I got a letter from somebody today when I came to the station about AIDS, and we'll do more about it later. Now, a woman who wanted to come visit me last December, I turned her down. I didn't like her. I didn't like the tone of her letter, and I didn't really want to see her, and I don't see those kinds of people or let them in the house. She lives in Alaska, and her father's a big official at NBC or ABC Broadcasting in Los Angeles. She wrote me a letter last week, but I didn't announce it on the air yet. She wanted me to tell you about the Jimmy Swaggart Christian Crusade that was in Oakland last week. Swaggart's name was in the newspaper with the top evangelists. He made $44 million. They broke it down into the various churches, and Swaggart was $44 million. Jim Bakker's Heritage Village is $53 million, so he's kind of small for $44 million. But Jim Swaggart, she wanted me to announce the crusade in Oakland that they had this last week and announced it on the air. And she told me that I should change my ways and announce this because she said, Mae, in the business you're in, this is her letter, she says, I understand you're cynical about organized religion, and so forth. She said, you can develop cancer quite easily in your field without the strength and blood of Jesus in my field. Therefore, will you please announce on your program that Jimmy Swaggart of the Christian Crusade will be in Oakland June 3rd, 4th, and 5th. And then I got a letter, not with a threat or suggestion like that, but similar from India this week. I thought, my goodness, World Watchers that's why I called it World Watchers. I'm watching them, but they're watching me. So from Alaska, I get a letter that you could develop cancer quite easily in your field. And then I got a letter from India about Jesus, all the way from India, along those lines. Jack Anderson mentioned in regard to the Seymour Hersh book. Oh, I'm going to be doing a lot more on that next week, the book on Henry Kissinger and Seymour Hersh. I didn't forget about it. It's very important. But Jack Anderson mentioned how when G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt of Operation Intercept and the Drug Enforcement Agency and so forth wanted to get at Jack Anderson for the articles he was writing at the time of Watergate, they went to the CIA physician and discussed various techniques for drugging Anderson. Remember, they were going to put something on the steering wheel of his car, and they also had toothpaste poisons that you could use, and I suggested this could possibly be what used on J. Edgar Hoover in May of '72. They went to the CIA doctor on suggestions on what to do to a person that they didn't like. So I thought this was interesting. He brought that out this week. Many of you knew it. Some of you didn't know it. Another point about medical, as long as we're talking about this subject, and then I'll wind up with some more on the Nugan hand. Hearts to Go from Africa, Newsweek, May 30th. What do you think of this? South African Hearts to Go. Dr. Christian Barnard, who performed the world's first heart transplant, is now exporting transplantable hearts from South Africa to Italy. Wow. How do you feel about that one? He's to Udine, Italy, and they can acquire South African hearts for transplant operations. You like that one? Whose hearts do you think they'll be? Huh? You want to bet? Okay. And once the preservation problem is over, Barnard hopes to ship 5 hearts a year to Italy. Oh, boy. That's pretty gross. It's called South African Hearts to Go. The medical business is an important industry. That's what the Howard Hughes memo said. Keep the Hughes Medical Institute going. It's the 4th largest industry in the United States, or it will become. And if we have a problem with not enough money in the government and a huge deficit, Ronald Reagan asked this last week, May 24th, for $48 million more for new nerve gas. You know how much there is around? There's enough to destroy the world. How many times over? And there's not any money, and there's a huge deficit. He's going to cut the taxes, slash those. He's going to ask more for defense. The one thing we really need is new chemical weapons. Did you read the story about the bee feces over in Southeast Asia, that they think it isn't Russian gas or chemicals, but the bees were crapping on the leaves that they tested? They found 3 leaves and said it's Russian gas, and now there's a story that the bees were doing it and not the Russians. There's a big conflict going on. Which one is doing it? The entire Soviet Union, or some bees down there? How can you take 2 leaves after all the defoliation that the United States did in Dow Chemical and the Agent Orange and what went to Southeast Asia? How would we have the nerve to say, here's 2 leaves to prove that this is what they're doing? So if you like this one, $48 million for new nerve gas, he just asked the Armed Services Committee for this. And the funny part is he gets everything he wants. Let's see if he gets that one, okay? Now, just to wind this up tonight, because I have talked about the Nugan Hand story, this article in the Miami Herald is important because every paper treats it like it's a news story, but at least it's new to them. And what this article is saying in the Miami Herald is that why won't the FBI release 119 pages of information compiled on Nugan Hand Bank, a bank that was American money in Australia, military money? It said the CIA has close ties to the bank. The bank is expected to dominate a current Royal Commission investigation into Nugan Hand activities. Now, this is the 5th major inquiry, it says, into the bank operation, and they have 10 other investigations going. Can you imagine? Down in Canada to unwind the people such as Bernie Houghton, who's over in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia was involved in a $22 billion scam of taking money from Italy down to Licio Gelli, the head Nazi from Italy, down in Argentina. Incidentally, Jelly's still in that prison in Switzerland. You never hear a word about him. He's been in there ever since Jamal. The night that Jamal was killed and Grace Kelly was killed, he was taken to a jail in Switzerland. He was checking out like $30 or $40 million that night. Haven't heard a word about him. And Edwin Wilson's pretty quiet, too. Murder Incorporated, He's pretty quiet now that his friend Duberstein was murdered and Kevin McCullough. You don't hear a thing about Edwin Wilson. All of them tied. Vatican Bank, Edwin Wilson, all of them tied to Nugan Bank. The fifth major inquiry into the operation. However, the questions about the possible links between this bank and the United States FBI and the CIA and the State Department and the Justice, as I told you before, are never far from the surface. How can our Justice Department rationalize being in this kind of operation? It goes into the background. The bank was founded in 1974 by Charles Nugan of the Green Berets and became a CIA operation. When the Australians requested information about the bank from the FBI, they only could see 70 pages, 189-page file. Some of it's been destroyed, and they're holding it back. They'll only let their government see 70 pages. Investigators who say they have never seen the FBI file suspect that they have turned it over to the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, but they describe it as a bizarre case, more bizarre than John le Carré's plot. And as I said before, John Kennedy Jr. studying history is as bizarre as Shakespeare or Greek tragedy. They said Nugan was leaving the country. Of course, Frank Nugan was murdered, and Mr. Hand hasn't been located. There's a rumor that he's down in Africa. They gave an alias of him, and it tells, as I say, about the military people and the money all over the different banks around the world, and the links to Bob Wilson, Representative Bob Wilson of California, was tied to William Colby. Now, Colby was instrumental with counterintelligence in 1974 in the SLA, the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, and when this bank began to fund the CIA covert operations around the world in Italy and in the United States. And the London Observer story, as I say, the land of killers, pushers, pimps, and corruption in high places, and it tells about various officials. It says it's touched the highest offices. The New South Wales Premier, the new one, Neville Wran, W-R-A-N, stood down voluntarily last week while his own Attorney General appointed a commission to investigate allegations that he tried to influence court cases, that he misappropriated over $54,000 from the Sydney, Australia, the largest football club. Then another top government official has been soliciting and running a call girl racket. That's like the Bobby Baker, Lyndon Johnson, J. Edgar Hoover. What's new down in Australia? We had it here. If we cleaned it out here, they wouldn't have had it in Australia. It goes into, as I say, the intelligence links, the effects into Indonesia, New Guinea, and various countries. And, of course, it goes to South America, to Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Klaus Barbie, Walter Ralph, and, as I say, Murder Incorporated. Now, I'm going to go back next week to the L.A. police files and Larry McDonald and the scandal of the Birch Society, because that, with Roy Cohn as partner, is the drug connection. And I'll have to do some charts for you, like I did that Vatican chart that time of the various networks. It was done in jest, but it was serious, the names. I'll have to outline these names for you, and then you can send for the sheet, because I admit it's complicated, and they interweave and appear and reappear certain names through this entire script. The important thing is that they are appearing, that there are articles in New York and in Miami and London, Australia, and, as I say, even Wall Street Journal and New York Times. Parts of the puzzle of the fascist, drug-dealing, church-related activity with the Central Intelligence Agency are surfacing every day. I have a pile more to share with you, and we'll get to them, but our time is up now. This is Mae Brussell, and this is KAZU-FM, and I'll be back with you next week in Pacific Grove, California.
The views expressed by Mae Brussell during World Watchers are those of the commentator and do not reflect the opinions of KAZU, its board of directors, or staff.